I began in the prior presentation a response to a handful of arguments that are found in the final 10 arguments of the GodIsImaginary.com arguments against the existence of God. And those arguments were 40, 41, 42, 44, and 48. And in the prior presentation, part one of this response to these 5 arguments was based on argument number 40, which seeks to attribute certain motives to Christians who pray. And when I was finishing the last presentation, I spent a fair amount of time in the prior presentation just talking about the experience of prayer and how a Christian approaches prayer in contrast to the atheists who wrote these various arguments. In those arguments, it treats prayer, I think, in a very simplistic way. It treats prayer as in a caricatured way, that prayer is really just a bunch of selfish little kids that are asking the Supreme Santa Claus a series of things that they want, and that's how prayer is understood. I suggested or tried to offer in the prior presentation that prayer for Christians is a much, much deeper reality. Sure, there are Christians out there who have a very simplistic and even distorted understanding of prayer. For the, especially for the Catholic perspective on these things, prayer is part of a life of growth and development in the spiritual life. We don't start out in the journey of faith already perfected or already finished. We're growing in our experience of prayer. And because we're constantly growing and seeking to deepen our life of prayer and relationship with God and virtue, we want to become more holy people, want to become more like God. The experience of prayer is a way of deepening that, of growing in that kind of relationship with God, so that we take on these attributes and these qualities, hopefully a growth in goodness and virtue and courage, in love and faith and hope. All of these things grow in us in time because of the relationship with God that we have. We acknowledge that we depend on God for this. We're not sufficient in ourselves to be all that God wants us to be. It is God's grace, we call it, God's power that comes to us. And a very important way in which God's grace and power comes to us is through the experience and the growth of the experience of prayer. One of the images that's often used in discussions of prayer among spiritual writers in the Catholic tradition is the image of a fire and the application of that fire to, say, iron or to some metal, where the metal begins to glow under the influence of the fire. That the heat of the fire is taken into the iron or the substance so that it begins to reflect it by glowing under its influence and under its heat. And I think of that image here as we talk about prayer. As a person grows more and more near to God in the experience of prayer, in lifting up the soul to God, in communing with God, in dialoguing with God, in listening to God, in paying attention to the ways that God speaks to us, then we begin to take on these attributes and characteristics that God expects us to have and that wants us to have. Characteristics like love and patience and goodness and courage and temperance, self-control, and so on. All of these things begin to grow in us as we grow closer to God and relate to God more deeply and develop in that. Another very important thing I should mention from the Catholic tradition with respect to prayer and the spiritual life in general is that we think of it as a series of conversions. That we don't start out already perfect, but we start out sort of like a child. And then as that child grows up, it develops a bigger perspective on things so that we grow into a more mature understanding and ability to dialogue and understand things. Take the way a 5-year-old child thinks about Christmas and the way that a 25-year-old thinks about Christmas or a 55-year-old person thinks about Christmas. For the small child, it's very much about what they get and about, what we would consider from an adult perspective rather childlike and even silly things that they focus on. For the grown-up, it's more perhaps about giving, and it's more perhaps about the traditions that are passed along in those contexts, so they think about it more maturely. Something like that goes on in the Christian journey. Now, back to the arguments here. We talked about motives, and I don't like to attribute motives to people because human beings are complex creatures, and because we're complex, oftentimes we're driven by things that cannot be easily identified. Perhaps we're not even aware of those, or perhaps there's a multiplicity of motives for things. Indeed, there are some Christians who have perhaps motivations like those that have been described. I certainly don't believe that that's everyone, and I certainly don't believe that those motivations are the ones that we set forth as being the ideal or the ultimate reasons why we pray. Again, I certainly do not believe that everyone that approaches prayer approaches it this way. In fact, the vast majority of people that I know who are concerned about prayer would not express these things as being primary motivations for them. Now, you can always insist that these are motivations beyond our conscious awareness, but I could do the same thing to the atheist. I could attribute, as I did in the prior presentation, I could attribute a whole bunch of different motives to the atheist. I wouldn't want to do that in a conversation with an atheist, but I'm only doing it here because it's easy to do. And it's unfair, I think, to try to generalize about the motivations of someone else. On the other hand, there might be some value in thinking about what might be some of the causes as to why someone would pray or not pray. But ultimately, what we have to pay attention to are what we set forth as the ideal. What are the real motivations, or what should be the right motivations for prayer? And I don't think it's fair to either side to pinpoint any particular individual and say that's why you do it, whether you acknowledge it or not. I think we should have a respectful conversation and recognize that we are more complicated than just throwing labels at one another or insulting one another with what I think to be the real psychological motivations for the actions of either the atheist or the Christian. Argument number 41 focused on the flipping the coin test, which I've addressed before, and I don't really want to talk about it again. I think it again trivializes the subject of prayer by saying that we should sit around flipping coins and praying about the results of flipping coins in order to determine whether there's any difference between actions that result from prayer and those that don't. As I've mentioned before, we've talked about that, and I think it's a trivializing of prayer, and it certainly is a far cry from what we understand to be the real essence of prayer. It's not the kind of thing we sit around and test God by flipping coins. This is rather distant from what we're talking about. This 42nd argument is entitled, Listen When God Talks. And what this focuses on are the various people that go around saying, God told me this and God told me that. Again, this may be more localized and present in some groups of people. I know as a Catholic, I don't hear people talking about, oh, God told me this and God told me that. I do know there are certain religious groups that do speak a lot about saying, you know, God said this to me and God said the other. And what the argument points out here is that oftentimes many things that people say that God told them are not particularly impressive at all. And so if God is really talking to all these people, and every time that somebody says God told me this, if God's really saying all those things, then really God is not saying much of worth or much to listen to. And I can agree that if people are going around saying God directly told me this, that, and the other, I certainly wouldn't want to type up all those things and add them to the back of my Bible, because I agree oftentimes people may attribute something that comes from their own mind to God for whatever motivations and whatever reasons. But again, I find in my experience it's extremely rare that I find someone who says, God told me this, as if God is directly delivering some type of word to them. On the other hand, I do find that there are people who seek for God's will, and they seek to listen to God by calming the human spirit, by praying, by reading the Scriptures, and by opening themselves to divine influence. But I find that the mature, thoughtful, spiritual people that I talk to do not insist on saying, I heard God sort of audibly say this to me or the other. Instead, they find themselves trying to listen to and discern the voice of God in and through the Scriptures, and in and through sort of listening to the inclinations of the human heart toward our true good that we discover through objective means, like the life of Christ, or through the teachings of the church or the saints, the holy people that have sort of led us and guided us into a deeper understanding of God's will and God's purpose. So I think that the simplistic way of saying that just everybody who says that God told them something or another, it poses some kind of problem for us. As a Catholic, I don't see that as being a particularly pressing problem. People saying that kind of thing and not acknowledging in their language that listening to God speak is something much richer, much deeper, and much more spiritually discerned, something that you have to develop a sense of how God speaks to us as human beings, and how to discover that. Like I say, in the Catholic tradition, we very much focus on listening to God speak as we sort of grow in the life of grace. So, for example, as I am drawn to love more, I am drawn to be more compassionate and more caring. I'm drawn to be more courageous, or I'm drawn to be more self-controlled, or I'm drawn to be less concerned about wealth and external things and more concerned about persons, or more concerned about being more available in service or to love God. It's in those kinds of experiences that I hear God speak, as I discover the directions in which God is taking me in my life, or I discover the movements of the human spirit toward true good. Not sitting around and praying flippant prayers and saying, I think God told me that I'm to, make $1 million this week or whatever, those kind of trivial sorts of things. But instead, it's a growing, a deepening and growing in the path of Christ and the path of true spirituality in which we hear God speak to us. The 44th argument, there are two more left. Let me see if I can cover these very quickly. The 44th argument is entitled, Think About a Christian Housewife. And the essential argument that is made here is, why would God pay attention to the insignificant prayers of a housewife? I guess what he's imagining here is a lady sitting around her house praying that God would take stains out of clothes, or those kinds of rather minor things. Why would God pay attention to that sort of prayer when there are millions of people in the world who need far more important things than a spot removed on their shirt or whatever? I would say in response to this, first of all, that I think that people who pray about what we might take to be rather trivial things, like a spot on a shirt or whatever, I think there's a positive side to that, inasmuch as the person is sort of constantly depending on God, that they have a sense of wanting God's assistance and God's help. I think I would agree, though, with the atheist that this requires some perspective, that praying about these sorts of trivial things and not seeing them in a larger perspective, that maybe the stain on the shirt is really not that important. Maybe there are bigger things that I should be thinking about rather than being obsessed with the smaller sort of things of everyday life or of my particular life, instead of thinking in bigger terms than that. And so I would say that this is an issue of maturity. It's not an issue with prayer as such. It's an issue with maturity and coming to sort of see things in perspective, and that these smaller things of my life are not necessarily the things that should dominate my attitude in relationship to God. But again, on the other hand, I would say that it's part of the growing up process in prayer, that we initially want to find reason to approach God and draw sort of an awareness of God's presence into our everyday life in prayer, and so even small things we address to God. I would also say that we should be careful in not belittling things that might in fact be important. So, for example, for me to pray for the well-being of my children today, or the positive results of a medical test for my spouse, or whatever, or that we get the funds that we need for some important project at our church or a school or whatever. I don't think we should think of those things, because there are bigger world problems, as being unimportant things. These are important to us. There are things that are part of our world, and because there are bigger problems in the world doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate basis of us being concerned about things that affect our world and affect our immediate sort of life in which we live. So I think that there are some positive things to be said here, but also on the other hand, there are some noble things to be acknowledged in sort of offering to God even the small things, the everyday things of our lives. Finally, number 48, compare prayer to a lucky horseshoe, it's called. And the question that's raised here is, what's the difference between prayer and rubbing a rabbit's foot or a lucky horseshoe or whatever? What's the difference between the two? And the way the argument goes is that both of them are essentially superstitious acts, because they're depending on some type of action to get some kind of spiritual benefit, when in fact there's no objective way to tell that one of them is better than the other. since I'm almost out of time, I'll simply throw out this, that there's a far distance between superstition, thinking that we can get some kind of spiritual benefit because of some physical object that we believe has some type of mysterious powers. That's a far cry from the Christian understanding of prayer as a deep dependence, personal dependence and recognition of God in relationship to us as creatures and communing with God. One of them is a personal act. It's committing our whole person and being to God, whereas the other is a superstitious act. It depends upon some type of magical qualities of some type of physical object. These are very, very different actions, and much more could be said about that. But that will conclude our brief look at these 5 arguments, again addressing the issue of prayer.